Hey everybody, this is an introduction to the book titled For Libertarian Communism. Uh, it's a bunch of writings of Daniel Guerin. The introduction is by David Barry. And I'm reading this because I've read this whole book before, but I just want to get a feel. That was before I started researching deeply into the controversies within Trotskyism in the 1940s. So that so this will hopefully refresh my memory, or I'll learn new things about Daniel Guerin's involvement in Trotskyism in the 1940s and his later move towards anarchist positions, or anarchistic positions at the very least. So I'll read the little preface, the forward and acknowledgments for this book, just because it's a page long. But, yeah. And this is from David Barry. This volume contains a selection of texts by the French revolutionary activist and historian Daniel Guerin, 1904 to 1988, published here in English translation for the first time. They were written between the 1950s and 1980s and appeared in France in a series of collections. Jeunesse du Socialisme Libertaire, Youth of Libertarian Socialism, published in 1959, and Pour un Marxisme Libertaire, bracket, for Libertarian Marxism, in bracket, published in 1969, and La Recherche d'un Communisme Libertaire, which translates as In Search of a Libertarian Communism, published in 1984. Further version of the collection was published after his death, Pour le Communisme Libertaire, bracket, for Libertarian Communism, end bracket, published in 2003. All of these contain slightly different selections of text around a common core of recurrent pieces, and the same is true of this English edition. We have tried to choose those texts which would be of most interest to present-day readers, but which also give a good understanding of Guerin's developing analysis of the failings of the left and his belief that the only way forward was through some kind of synthesis of Marxism and anarchism. We are grateful to the Spartacus Collective, to Daniel Guerin, and to Anne Guerin for permission to publish these translations. The footnotes are Guerin's, except where indicated. Additional explanatory material is followed by my initials. We have tried, where possible and practical, to provide references to English translations of Guerin's sources, and I am grateful to Ian McKay for his help with this. I would also like to thank Chris Reynolds, Martin O'Shaughnessy, and Christoph Romana for their help in tracking down the source of Guerin's reference to Armand Gatti, and Danny Evans and James Yeoman for their advice regarding films about the Spanish Revolution. Guerin was a prolific writer on an exceptionally wide range of topics, and relatively little has been translated into English. A list of his publications in English can be found at the end of the volume. For further information, including a full bibliography and links to text available online, please visit the website of the Association des Amis de Daniel Guerin, Association of the Friends of Daniel Guerin. Okay, so here we go. The Search for a Libertarian Communism, Daniel Guerin and the, quote, synthesis of Marxism and anarchism. Quote, I have a horror of sects, of compartmentalization, of people who are separated by virtually nothing and who nevertheless face each other as if across an abyss, end quote. Daniel Guerin. As Guerin once wrote of the fate suffered by anarchism, Daniel Guerin, who lived from 1904 to 1988, has himself been the victim of unwarranted neglect and, in some circles at least, of undeserved discredit. For although many people know of Guerin, relatively few seem aware of the breadth of his contribution. Guerin's writings cover a vast range of subjects, from fascism and the French Revolution to the history of the European and American labor movements, from Marxist and anarchist theory to homosexual liberation, from French colonialism to the Black Panthers, and from Paul Gauguin to French nuclear tests in the Pacific, not to mention several autobiographical volumes. As an activist, Guerin was involved in various movements and campaigns: anti-colonialism, anti-racism, anti-militarism, and homosexual liberation. This is a man who counted among his personal friends Francois Mauriac, Simone Weil, C.L.R. James, and Richard Wright, to name but a few of the famous names which litter his autobiographies. Guerin's youthful literary efforts provoked a letter of congratulations from Colette. He met and corresponded with Leon Trotsky, and he had dinner in tête-à-tête, I don't know what the hell that means, with Ho Chi Minh. You should be noted, had a lot of Trotskyists in Vietnam killed. See what the things I have on this channel from No Van, a Vietnamese Trotskyist who became a council communist when he moved to France. Jean-Paul Sartre judged his reinterpretation of the French Revolution to be, quote, one of the only contributions by contemporary Marxists to have enriched historical studies, end quote. The great liberation activist Pierre Hahn believed his own generation of homosexuals owed more to Guerin than to any other person, and that the Martinican poet Aimé Césaire paid tribute to his work on decolonization. Noam Chomsky considers Guerin's writings on anarchism to be of great importance to the development of contemporary socialist thought. Yet despite such assessments, and although there is widespread and enduring interest in Guerin among activists, he has been badly neglected by academic researchers in France, and especially in the English-speaking world. This is doubtless due to a combination of factors. Guerin never held an academic post or any leadership position, except briefly at the Libertarian as director of the Commission du Livre, a government agency that oversaw the book publishing industry. Guerin was consistently anti-Stalinist during a period when the influence of the French Communist Party, both among intellectuals and within the labor movement, was overwhelming. He never fit easily into ideological or political pigeonholes and was often misunderstood and misrepresented. And in France in the 1960s and 1970s, his bisexuality was shocking even for many on the left. Guerin was, in a word, a, quote, troublemaker. Concerned that his reinterpretation of the French Revolution, La lutte des classes sous la Première République, 1793 to 1797, which I think is class struggle in the First Republic, 1793 to 1797. Published in 1946, had been misunderstood. In 1947, Daniel Guerin wrote to his friend, the socialist Marcel Pivert, that the book was to be seen as, quote, an introduction to a synthesis of anarchism and Marxism-Leninism I would like to write one day, end quote. Guerin. What exactly did Guerin mean by this, quote, synthesis, and how and why had he come to be convinced of its necessity? For as Alex Kalinikos has commented, quote, genuinely innovative syntheses are rare and difficult to arrive at. Too often attempted syntheses amount merely to banality, incoherence, or eclecticism, end quote. Alex Kalinikos. It must, however, be noted from the outset that Guerin had no pretensions to being a theorist. Guerin saw himself first and foremost as an activist and secondly as a historian. Indeed, from the day in 1930 when he abandoned the poetry and novels of his youth, all of Guerin's research and writings were concerned more or less directly with his political commitments. Guerin's developing critique of Marxism and his later interest in the relationship between Marxism and anarchism were motivated by his own direct experience of active participation in revolutionary struggles on a number of fronts. They can thus be clarified when studied in relation to social and political developments. Although Guerin in some of his autobiographical or semi-autobiographical writings had a tendency to divide his life into more or less distinct, quote, phases, and despite the fact that Guerin's political or ideological trajectory may seem to some to be rather protean, I would argue that there was in fact an underlying ideological consistency, even if changing circumstances meant Guerin's, quote, organizational options, end quote, as Guerin put it, changed in different periods of his life. A historical materialist all his life, Guerin remained attached to a revolutionary socialism with a strong ethical or moral core. Although it was many years before Guerin found an organization which lived up to his expectations, Guerin was always at heart a libertarian communist, developing an increasingly strong belief in the need for a, quote, total revolution, end quote, which would attach as much importance to issues of race, gender, and sexuality as to workplace-based conflict. Whether specifically in his commitment to anti-colonialism or to sexual liberation, or more generally in his emphasis on what today would be called intersectionality, Guerin was undoubtedly ahead of his time. New section, early influences. Despite coming from the, quote, grande bourgeoisie, a background which Guerin would come to reject, Guerin owed much to the influence of his branch of the family. Humanist, liberal, and cultured, both his parents had been passionately pro-Dreyfus, both were influenced by Tolstoy's ethical and social ideas, and his father's library contained the Communist Manifesto as well as works by Benoit, Malone, Proudhon, and Kropotkin. The young Daniel seems to have been particularly influenced by his father's pacifism and was also deeply affected by his own reading of Tolstoy's Diaries and Resurrection. In the context of the increasingly polarized debates of the interwar period between the far left and far right, quote, Marat versus Marx, end quote, as Guerin put it, Guerin identified with the Marxist extreme left from a relatively early age. Guerin's, quote, discovery of the Parisian working class and of the concrete realities of their everyday existence, to a large extent through his homosexual relationships with young workers, reinforced a profound, quote, workerism which would stay with him for the rest of his life. New section, the bankruptcy of Stalinism and social democracy. This workerism would lead Guerin in 1930 to 1931 to join the syndicalist group around the veteran revolutionary Pierre Monod. Typically, perhaps, Guerin's first real active involvement was in the campaign for the reunification of the two major syndicalist federations, the CGT, dominated at that time by the PS SFIO, the Socialist Party, and the CGTU, dominated by the PCF, the French Communist Party. Guerin's workerism was also responsible for a strong attraction towards the PCF, far more, quote, proletarian than the Socialist Party, despite his, quote, visceral anti-Stalinism, end quote, and what he saw as the party's, quote, crass ideological excesses, its inability to win over the majority of workers, and its mechanical submission to the Kremlin's orders, end quote. Guerin. Yet Guerin was no more impressed with the PS, the Socialist Party, which he found petty bourgeois, narrow-minded, dogmatically anti-communist, and obsessed with electioneering. Quote, the tragedy for many militants of our generation was their repugnance at having to opt for one or the other of the two main organizations which claimed, wrongly, to represent the working class. Stalinism and social democracy both repelled us each in its own way, yet those workers who were actively political were in one of these two parties. The smaller intermediate groups and the extremist sects seemed to us to be doomed to impotence and marginalization. The SFIO, despite the social conformism of its leadership, at least had the advantage over the Communist Party of enjoying a large degree of internal democracy and to some extent allowed revolutionaries to express themselves, whereas the monolithic automatism of Stalinism forbade any critics from opening their mouths and made it very difficult for them even to stay in the party, end quote. Guerin. Hence Guerin's decision to rejoin the SFIO in 1935, shortly before the creation by Monsieur Pivert of the Gauche Revolutionnaire. I think, I'm not sure, but I don't know if I'll say this, but this has been a period of the French turn, I believe. So, in the 1930s, Trotsky advised, at least the members in France, but also in other countries as well, to enter into their local socialist parties as a wing within them, eventually convinces him to abandon the strategy, and because he feels that a revolutionary situation is on the horizon, and thus that Trotskyists as a vanguard party, or the Bolshevik Leninists, as they would call themselves at this point, would need to be independent in order to facilitate the leadership of these revolutions. Anyway, so I don't know if that's why Guerin entered the SFIO in 1935. I don't know if maybe the SFIO, I believe that's the organization that the Trotskyists entered, which I guess is merged by it says PS-SFIO earlier, so I guess that is the Socialist Party. Anyway, hence Guerin's decision to rejoin the SFIO in 1935, shortly before the creation by Monsieur Pivert of the Gauche Revolutionnaire, revolutionary left, tendency within the party, of which he would become a leading member. Guerin was attracted by Pivert's, quote, Luxembourgist, libertarian, and syndicalist tendencies. He was consistently on the revolutionary wing of the Gauche Revolutionnaire and of its successor, the Parti Socialiste Ouvrier et Paysan, PSOP, or Workers' and Peasants Socialist Party, created when the Gauche Revolutionnaire was expelled from the SFIO in 1938. And in the Popular Front period, Guerin drew a clear distinction between what he called the, quote, Popular Front Number 1, an electoral alliance between social democracy, Stalinism, and bourgeois liberalism, and the, quote, Popular Front Number 2, the powerful extra-parliamentary working-class movement, which came into conflict with the more moderate and more bourgeois Popular Front government. Guerin viewed the, quote, entrism of the French Trotskyists in these years as a welcome counterbalance to the reformism of the majority of the Socialist Party. Indeed, in the 1930s, Guerin agreed with Trotsky's position on many issues, on the nature of fascism and how to stop it, on war and revolutionary proletarian internationalism, on opposition to the collusion between, quote, social patriotism, i.e. mainstream social democracy, and, quote, national communism, i.e. the PCF, as well as any pact with the bourgeois radicals, and on the need to fight actively for the liberation of Europe's colonies. As Guerin comments after recounting in glowing terms his sole meeting with Trotsky in Barbizon, near Fontainebleau, in 1935, quote, on a theoretical level as well as on the level of political practice, Trotsky would remain for many of us both a stimulus to action and a teacher, end quote. Guerin. Ultimately, Guerin's experience of the labor movement and of the left in the 1930s, as well as his research on the nature and origins of fascism and Nazism, led Guerin to reject both social democracy and Stalinism as effective strategies for defeating fascism and preventing war. Indeed, the left, quote, divided, ossified, negative, and narrow-minded, end quote, in Guerin's words, bore its share of responsibility and had made tragic errors. The SFIO was criticized by Guerin for its electoralism and for allowing its hands to be tied by the Parti Radical Socialiste, quote, a bourgeois party whose corruption and bankruptcy were in large part responsible for the fascist explosion, end quote. For its incomprehension of the nature of the capitalist state, which led to the impotence of Leon Blum's 1936 Popular Front government, for its failure to take fascism seriously and to aid the Spanish Republicans, despite the various warnings until it was too late, and for its obsessive rivalry with the PCF was equally harshly criticized by Guerin for what seemed to him to be its blind obedience to the Comintern, the criminal stupidity of the Comintern's, quote, third period, and for its counter-revolutionary strategy in both Spain and in France. As for Trotsky, Guerin disagreed with Trotsky over the creation of the Fourth International in 1938, which seemed to him premature and divisive. More generally, Guerin was critical of what he saw as Trotsky's tendency continually to transpose the experiences of the Russian Bolsheviks onto contemporary events in the West and of his, quote, authoritarian rigidness, end quote. Trotskyism, Guerin argued, represented, quote, the ideology of the infallible leader who, in an authoritarian fashion, directs the policy of a fraction or of a party, end quote. What Guerin wanted to see was, quote, the full development of the spontaneity of the working class, end quote. Writing in 1963, Guerin would conclude with regard to such disputes over revolutionary tactics, quote, the revolutionary organization, which was lacking in June 1936, was not, in my opinion, an authoritarian leadership emanating from a small group or sect, but an organ for the coordination of the workers' councils, growing directly out of the occupied workplaces. The mistake of the Gauche Revolutionnaire was not so much that it was unable, because of its lack of preparation, to transform itself into a revolutionary party on the Leninist or Trotskyist model, but that it was unable, to help the working class to find for itself, the working class's own form of power structure, to confront the fraud that was the Popular Front number 1, end quote. Daniel Guerin. So as Guerin summarized the state of the left in the 1930s, quote, everything made the renewal of the concepts and methods of struggle employed by the French left both indispensable and urgent, end quote. Daniel Guerin. These debates on the left regarding tactics, working class autonomy or, quote, popular frontism, and the role of the, quote, avant-garde, or in syndicalist terms, the, quote, activist minority, end quote, minorité agaçante, would recur in the post-war years, and Guerin's position would vary little. New section, break from Trotskyism. Despite Guerin's reservations about Trotskyism, Guerin's analysis of the nature of the Vichy regime is very similar to that put forward by the Fourth International, and Guerin was also impressed with Trotsky's manifesto of May 1940, The Imperialist War and the World Proletarian Revolution, La Guerre impérialiste et la Révolution prolétarienne mondiale, including in it a collection of Trotsky's writings on the Second World War he would edit in 1970. Guerin worked with the Trotskyists in the resistance, not least because they remained true to their internationalism and to their class politics. The Trotskyists rejected, for instance, what Guerin saw as the PCF's demagogic nationalism. Guerin was thus closely involved with the Trotskyist attempts to organize extremely dangerous anti-militarist and anti-Nazi propaganda among German soldiers. Guerin also contributed to the activities of a group of Trotskyist workers producing newsletters carrying reports of workplace struggle against both French employers and the German authorities. However, an extended study tour of the United States from 1946 to 1949, which included visits to branches of prominent militants of the Socialist Workers' Party and the Breakaway Workers' Party, represented a turning point in Guerin's, quote, Trotskyism. In a 1948 letter to Marcel Prévert, Guerin commented on his unhappiness at the Trotskyist tendency to, quote, repeat mechanically old formulae without rethinking those formulae, relying lazily and uncritically on the undeniably admirable writings of Trotsky, end quote. Guerin. Looking back 30 years later, Guerin would conclude, quote, it was thanks to the American Trotskyists, despite their undeniable commitment, that I ceased forever believing in the virtues of revolutionary parties built on authoritarian Leninist lines, end quote. The, quote, mother of us all, end quote. Unlike many of the left associated with post-war ideological renewal, most of whom would focus on a revision or reinterpretation of Marxism, often at a philosophical level, Sartre, Althusser, or Henri Lefebvre, for example, Guerin, the historian, began with a return to what he saw as the source of revolutionary theory and praxis. In 1946, Guerin published his study of class struggle in the First French Republic, 1793 to 1797. The aim of the book was to, quote, draw lessons from the greatest, longest, and deepest revolutionary experience France had ever known, lessons which would help regenerate the revolutionary libertarian socialism of today, end quote. And to, quote, extract some ideas which would be applicable to our time and of direct use to the contemporary reader who has yet to fully digest the lessons of another revolution, the Russian Revolution, end quote. Applying the concepts of permanent revolution and combined and uneven development, inspired by Trotsky's history of the Russian Revolution, Guerin argued that the beginnings of a conflict of class interest could already be detected within the revolutionary camp between, quote, embryonic proletariat, the bras nus, parenthesis, manual workers, and parenthesis, represented by the enragés, and the bourgeoisie, represented by Robespierre and the Jacobin leadership. For Guerin, the French Revolution thus represented not only the birth of bourgeois parliamentary democracy, but also the emergence of a, quote, new type of democracy, end quote. A form of working-class direct democracy is seen, however imperfectly, in the, quote, sections, local popular assemblies, precursors of the commune. Sorry, there's something on my leg. Oh, sorry. Where am I? For Guerin, the French Revolution thus represented not only the birth of bourgeois parliamentary democracy, but also the emergence of a, quote, new type of democracy, end quote. A form of working-class direct democracy is seen, however imperfectly, in the, quote, sections, local popular assemblies, precursors of the Commune of 1871 and the Soviets of 1905 and 1917. In the second edition of the work, 1968, he would add, quote, the Commune of May 68, end quote, to that genealogy. Similarly, this interpretation tended to emphasize the political ambivalence of the bourgeois Jacobin leadership, which, quote, hesitated continually between the solidarity uniting the Jacobin leadership with the popular classes against the aristocracy, and that uniting all the wealthy property-owning classes against those who owned little or nothing, end quote. Guerin. For Guerin, the essential lesson to be drawn from the French Revolution was thus the conflict of class interests between the bourgeoisie and the working classes. Bourgeois social democratic and Stalinist interpretations of the revolution, like those of Jean Jaurès, Albert Mathiez, and many others, which tended to maintain the, quote, cult of Robespierre and to reinforce the labor movement's dependence on bourgeois democracy, were thus to be rejected. Class struggle in the First Republic has been described by Eric Hobsbawm, himself a long-standing Communist Party member, as a, quote, curious combination of libertarian and Trotskyist ideas, not without a dash of Rosa Luxemburg, end quote. Eric Hobsbawm. It not only shocked many academic historians of the Revolution, especially those with more or less close links to the PCF, Georges Lefebvre, and especially Albert Soboul and Georges Roudet, but also those politicians who, in Guerin's words, quote, have been responsible for perverting and undermining true proletarian socialism, end quote. The fallout was intense, and the ensuing debate lasted for many years. Indeed, Guerin is still today regarded with distrust by many historians influenced by the Republican and mainstream Marxist (non-Trotskyist) interpretations of the revolution as a bourgeois revolution. Guerin brought that whole historiographical tradition into question. The political significance was that the revolutionary terror had been used as a parallel to justify Bolshevik repression of democratic freedoms and repression of more leftist movements. Stalin had been compared to Robespierre. The Jacobin tradition of patriotism and national unity in defense of the bourgeois democratic republic has been one of the characteristics of the dominant tendencies within the French left, and therefore essential to the political mythologies of the Popular Front and the Resistance. Guerin, as Ian Birchall has put it, quote, was polemicizing against the notion of a resistance uniting all classes against the foreign invader, end quote. What is more, the PCF, the French Communist Party, had been campaigning since 1945 for unity at the top with the SFIO, and in the 1956 elections called for the re-establishment of a Popular Front government. Guerin, as we have seen, argued that alliance with the supposedly, quote, progressive bourgeoisie on the struggle against fascism was a contradiction at the heart of the Popular Front strategy. Guerin's conception of the way forward for the left is very different. At a time when fascism in the form of Poujadism looked as if it might once again be a real threat, Guerin argued that what was needed was a, quote, genuine Popular Front, that is, a grassroots social movement rather than a governmental alliance, a truly popular movement centered on the working classes that would bring together the labor movement and all socialists who rejected both the pro-American SFIO and the pro-Soviet PCF. Quote, and if we succeed in building this new Popular Front, Let us not repeat the mistakes of the 1936 Popular Front, which because of its timidity and impotence ended up driving the middle classes towards fascism rather than turning them away from fascism, as had been its aim. Only a combative Popular Front, which dares to attack big business, which will be able to halt our middle classes on the slope which leads to fascism and to their destruction." End quote. New section, Developing Critique of Leninism. Guerin's friend and translator C.L.R. James wrote in 1958 of the political significance of Guerin's revisiting the history of the French Revolution. Quote, "Such a book had never yet been produced and could not have been produced in any epoch other than our own. It is impregnated with the experience and study of the greatest event of our time, the development and then degeneration of the Russian Revolution, and is animated implicitly by one central concern. How can the revolutionary masses avoid the dreadful pitfalls of bureaucratization and the resurgence of a new oppressive state power, and instead establish a system of direct democracy?" End quote. James, 1958. It was in very similar terms that Guerin expressed the central question facing the left in a 1959 essay, La Révolution des Jacobinistes. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. This is an important text in Guerin's ideological itinerary. Continuing the political analysis, Guerin began in La lutte de classe sous la Première République and developed in La Révolution française et nous, The French Revolution and Us, written in 1944 but not published until 1969, and Quand le fascisme nous dévainquait, I don't know if I'm saying that right, When Fascism Was Winning, published in 1955. In La Révolution des Jacobinistes, Guerin argued that the, quote, Jacobin traits in Marxism and particularly in Leninism were the result of an incomplete understanding on Marx and Engels' part of the class nature of Jacobinism and the Jacobin dictatorship, to be distinguished, according to Guerin, from the democratically controlled, quote, revolutionary coercion, end quote, exercised by the popular sections. Thus, by applying a historical materialist analysis to the experience of the French revolutionary movement, Guerin came to argue, essentially, that, quote, authentic socialism, contrary to what had been argued by Blanqui or Lenin, arose spontaneously out of working class struggle, and that it was fundamentally libertarian. Authoritarian conceptions of party organization and revolutionary strategy had their origins in bourgeois or even aristocratic modes of thought. Guerin believed that when Marx and Engels referred, rather vaguely, to a, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, they envisaged it as a dictatorship exercised by the working class as a whole, rather than by an avant-garde. But, Guerin continued, Marx and Engels did not adequately differentiate their interpretation from that of the Blanquists. This made possible Lenin's later authoritarian conceptions. Quote, Lenin, who saw himself as both a Jacobin and a Marxist, invented the idea of the dictatorship of a party substituting itself for the working class and acting by proxy in the working class's name, end quote. Guerin. This, for Guerin, was where it all started to go badly wrong. Quote, the double experience of the French and Russian revolutions has taught us that this is where we touch upon the central mechanism whereby direct democracy, the self-government of the people, is transformed gradually by the introduction of the revolutionary, quote, dictatorship into the reconstitution of an apparatus for the oppression of the people, end quote. Guerin. Guerin's leftist, class-based critique of Jacobinism thus had three related implications for contemporary debates about political tactics and strategy. First, it implied a rejection of, quote, class collaboration, end quote, and therefore any type of alliance with the bourgeois left, popular frontism. Second, it implied that the revolutionary movement should be uncompromising, that it should push for more radical social change and not stop halfway, which, as Saint-Just famously remarked, was to dig one's own grave. Rejecting the Stalinist emphasis on the unavoidability of separate historical, quote, stages in the long-term revolutionary process. Third, it implied a rejection of both the Leninist model of a centralized, hierarchical party dominating the labor movement and of the, quote, substitutionism, end quote, substitution of the party for the proletariat, which has come to characterize the Bolshevik dictatorship. This critique clearly had its sources both in Guerin's reinterpretation of the French Revolution and in the social and political conditions of the time. La Révolution française et nue was informed by Guerin's critique of social democratic and Stalinist strategies before, during, and after the war. The article La Révolution des Jacobinistes was written at a significant historic moment for socialists in France. After the artificial national unity of the immediate post-war years had given way to profound social and political conflict, as Guy Mollet's SFIO became increasingly identified with the defense of the bourgeois status quo in the Western camp in the Cold War, as the immensely powerful post-war PCF reeled under the effects of the Hungarian uprising of 1956 and of the Khrushchev revelations the same year, and as the unpopular and politically unstable Fourth Republic collapsed in the face of a threatened military coup. It was this situation which made renewal of the left so necessary. In 1959, Guerin also picked up on the results of a survey of the attitudes of French youth towards politics, which indicated to him two things. First, that what alienated the younger generation from, quote, socialism was, quote, bureaucrats and purges. And second, that as one respondent put it, French youth are becoming more and more anarchist, end quote. Ever the optimist, Guerin declared, quote, far from allowing ourselves to sink into doubt, inaction, and despair, the time has come for the French left to begin again from zero, to rethink the French left's problems from their very foundations, ... The necessary synthesis of the ideas of equality and liberty, ... cannot and must not be attempted, in my opinion, in the framework and to the benefit of a bankrupt bourgeois democracy. It can and must only be done in the framework of socialist thought, which remains, despite everything, the only reliable value of our times. The failure of both reformism and Stalinism imposes on us the urgent duty to find a way of reconciling proletarian democracy with socialism, freedom with revolution, end quote. Daniel Guerin. New section. From Trotskyism to New Left to Anarchism. What Guerin would thus do, which was quite remarkable in post-liberation France, was endeavor to separate Marxism from Bolshevism. Guerin's continued friendly and supportive contacts with a number of Trotskyists notwithstanding, and it is noteworthy that he had contact in this period with a number of prominent non-orthodox Marxists. After 1945, especially, Daniel Guerin was involved, centrally or more peripherally, in a number of circles or networks, and according to the sociologist Michel Crozier, who, since their meeting in America, saw Guerin as something of a mentor, Guerin self-identified in the late 1940s and 1950s, quote, the golden age of the left intelligentsia, end quote, as, quote, independent Marxist. As a, quote, independent Marxist, end quote. Guerin. As a, quote, independent Marxist, end quote, Guerin. CLR James, for instance, has already been mentioned. He and Guerin appeared to have met in the 1930s. They became good friends. Guerin visited him while in the USA in 1949, and they corresponded over many years. Convinced of the contemporary relevance and of the importance of Guerin's analysis, James even began to translate La Lutte de Classe into English and described the book as, quote, one of the most important modern textbooks in ... the study of Marxism, end quote, and, quote, one of the great theoretical landmarks of our movement, end quote. Similarly, Guerin had first met Karl Korsch in Berlin in 1932 and visited Karl Korsch in his exile in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1947, where, according to Guerin, they spent many hours together. The two would collaborate a decade later in their bibliographical researches on the relationship between Marx and Bakunin. Also during his time in the USA in 1947, Guerin became friendly with a group of refugee Germans in Washington, D.C., dissident Marxists, quote, as hospitable as they were brilliant, end quote, connected with the so-called Frankfurt School, Franz Neumann, Otto Kirchheimer, and Herbert Marcuse. In France, Guerin already knew the leading figures in the Socialisme ou Barbarie group from their days in the Fourth International's PCI, Internationalist Communist Party. Together, Guerin's papers contained a number of texts produced by the so-called Chalut Mental tendency in the late 1940s. It's interesting to note that the Socialisme ou Barbarie group's theses on the Russian Revolution feature in the list of theories and authors discovered by the Algerian nationalist and revolutionary Mohamed Harbi, thanks to his first meeting with Guerin at a meeting of the PCI discussion group Le Cercle Lénine in 1953. And of course, the Chalut Mental tendency became Socialisme ou Barbarie. And I think there's a big Trotskyist, I think it was I can't remember if it was the Second International Congress, I'm not sure, of the Fourth International in 1948. Guerin, whose name I can't remember whose name I can't think of right off the top of my head at the time, is nom de guerre or nom de plume. It was something with a G though. It's like Galleon or something like that. I can't remember. But he was also he signed some of the things that, or supported some of the motions put forward by both the Chalut Mental tendency and the Workers' Party tendency around the Workers' Party, which would become the Independent Socialist League in the United States, centered around Max Shachtman. Anyway, in 1965, Guerin took part with Castoriadis, Lefort, and Edgar Morin in a forum on, quote, Marxism Today, organized by Socialisme ou Barbarie, whose work Morin would describe a few years later as representing, quote, an original synthesis of Marxism and Anarchism, end quote. Guerin also contributed to Morin's journal Arguments, 1956-1962, an important journal launched in the response to the events of 1956 with a view to a, quote, reconsideration not only of Stalinist Marxism but of the Marxist way of thinking, end quote, and had been essentially involved in the French, quote, Titoist around Claude Marat and the Revue Contemporaine, 1950 to 1951. I think Edgar Morin's argument was important, is where, what the hell is the guy's name? I cannot think of the guy's name, but Christos Mamos has an interview with him on this channel. I cannot think of his name for the fucking life of me, though. But he was like a Greek, he was like Castoriadis, a Greek, emigre to France, and he coined the term open Marxism in the 1950s. I believe the 1950s, it might have been a little later, but I believe it was the 1950s, in the journal Arguments. Anyway, the present state of our knowledge of these relationships does not enable us to be precise regarding the nature, extent, or direction of any influence which might have resulted, but the least we can say is that Guerin was at the heart of the left intellectual ferment which characterized these years, that Guerin had an address book, as his daughter Anne recently put it, as fat as a dictionary, and that he shared many of the theoretical preoccupations of many leading Marxists in the 20 years or so following the Second World War, be it the party form, bureaucracy, alienation, or sexual repression. In the mid to late 1950s, like other former or, quote, critical Trotskyists, as well as ex-members of the FCL, the Libertarian Communist Federation, banned in 1957, Guerin belonged, though, quote, without much conviction, end quote, to a series of left socialist organizations, the Nouvelle Gauche, the New Left, the Union de la Gauche Socialiste, Union of the Socialist Left, and briefly the Parti Socialiste Unifié, I don't know, Unified Socialist Party. But it was also around 1956 that the Guerin, quote, discovered, end quote, anarchism, Looking back on a 1930 boat trip to Vietnam and the small library he had taken with him, Guerin commented that all of the authors he had studied, Marx, Proudhon, Georges Sorel, Hubert, Le Gardel, Fernand, Pelloutier, Lenin, Trotsky, Gandhi, and many others, quote, Marx had without a doubt been preponderant, end quote. But having become increasingly critical of Leninism, Guerin discovered the collected works of Bakunin, a, quote, revelation, which rendered Guerin forever, quote, allergic to all versions of authoritarian socialism, whether Jacobin, Marxist, Leninist, or Trotskyist, end quote. Guerin would describe the following 10 years or so, either the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s, in which saw the publication notably of the popular anthology Ni Dieu ni Maître, I think that's No Gods, No Masters, and of L'Anarchisme, which sold like hotcakes at the Sorbonne in May 1958 as his, quote, classical anarchist phase, end quote. Guerin became especially interested in Proudhon, whom he admired as the first theorist of autogestion, or worker self-management, Bakunin representative of revolutionary working-class anarchism close to Marxism. Guerin insisted, yet remarkably prescient about the dangers of statist communism, and Max Stirner, appreciated as a precursor of 1968 because of his determination to attack bourgeois prejudice and Puritanism. The discovery of Bakunin coincided with the appearance of the Hungarian workers' community and the Soviet suppression of the Hungarian uprising in 1956. These events provoked Guerin into studying the communist tradition, which had come to be seen by many as representing a form of revolutionary socialist direct democracy in contrast to the Bolshevik-controlled Soviets. It was also during the 1950s that Guerin, moving on from his study of the French Revolution, had begun to research the political debates and conflicts within the First International, and more generally the relationship between Marxism and anarchism. New section, Guerin and Anarchism. Guerin had had no contact with the anarchist movement before the Second World War, than to read E. Armand's individual anarchist organ, L'En Dehors. According to Georges Fontenis, a leading figure in the post-war anarchist movement, Guerin began to have direct contact with the then Anarchist Federation, FA, in 1945, when the second edition of his Fascism and Big Business was published. The Anarchist Federation's newspaper, The Libertaire, reviewed Guerin's books favorably, and in the 1950s, Guerin was invited to Galas of the FA, and from 1953 of the FCL to do book signings. He got to know leading anarchist militants and would drop in at the FCL's offices on the Quai de Valmy in Paris. Fontenis described Guerin as being, quote, an active sympathizer, end quote, at that point. His newfound sympathies certainly seemed to have been sufficiently well known for the U.S. Embassy in Paris to refuse him a visa to visit his wife and daughter in 1950 on the grounds that he was both a Trotskyist and an anarchist. The ideological stance of the FCL, Libertarian Marxism, and its position on the Algerian War, quote, critical support for the nationalist movement in the context of the struggle against French bourgeois imperialism, proved doubly attractive for the anti-colonialist Guerin, in part for these reasons. 1954, the beginning of the Algerian War of Independence, represented the beginning of a relationship, notably with Fontenis, leading light of the FCL, which, as we shall see, would ultimately take Guerin into the ranks of the, quote, Libertarian Communist movement. One second. Coffee break. Let's get these headphones back in. Where the hell am I? In 1959, Guerin published a collection of articles entitled Jeunesse du Socialisme Libertaire, literally the youth, or perhaps the rise or invention of libertarian socialism. This represents both a continuation of the critique of Marxism and Leninism begun during the war, and, as far as I am aware, Guerin's first analysis of the 19th century anarchist tradition. Significantly, a copy of this collection has been found with a handwritten dedication to Maximilien Rubel, quote, to whom this little book owes so much, end quote. A few years later, in 1965, Daniel Guerin would publish both Anarchism from Theory to Practice and the two-volume anthology No Gods, No Masters. The purpose was to, quote, rehabilitate, end quote, anarchism, and the anthology represented the, quote, dossier of evidence, end quote. Quote, anarchism has for many years suffered from an undeserved disrepute, from an injustice which has manifested itself in three ways. Firstly, its detractors claim that it is simply a thing of the past. It did not survive the great revolutionary tests of our time, the Russian Revolution and the Spanish Revolution. It has no place in the modern world, a world characterized by centralization, by large political and economic entities, by the idea of totalitarianism. There is nothing left for the anarchists to do but, quote, by force of circumstance, end quote, as Victor Serge put it, to, quote, join the revolutionary Marxist, end quote. Secondly, the better to devalue it, those who would slander anarchism serve up a tendentious interpretation of anarchism's doctrine. Anarchism is essentially individualistic, particularistic, hostile to any form of organization. Anarchism leads to fragmentation, to the egocentric withdrawal of small local units of administration and production. It is incapable of centralizing or planning. It is nostalgic for the, quote, golden age. It tends to resurrect archaic social forms. It suffers from a childish optimism. Its, quote, idealism takes no account of the solid realities of the material infrastructure. It is incurably petit bourgeois. It places itself outside of the class movement of the modern proletariat. In a word, anarchism is, quote, reactionary. And finally, certain of anarchism's commentators take care to rescue from oblivion and to draw attention to only its most controversial deviations, such as terrorism, individual assassinations, propaganda by explosives, and so on, end quote. Daniel Guerin. Although, as we have seen, Guerin referred to the two books, Anarchism and No Gods, No Masters, as representing Guerin's, quote, classical anarchist, end quote, phase, and despite Guerin's assertion that the basics of anarchist doctrine were relatively homogeneous, elsewhere, it was very clear that both books focused on a particular kind of anarchism. To begin with, quote, the fundamental aspect of these doctrines, end quote, was for Guerin that, quote, anarchy is indeed above all synonymous with socialism. The anarchist is, first and foremost, a socialist whose aim is to put an end to the exploitation of man by man. Anarchism is no more than one of the branches of socialist thought, ... Adolf Fischer, one of the Chicago martyrs, quote, every anarchist is a socialist, but every socialist is not necessarily an anarchist, end quote. In Pour un Marxisme Libertaire, Guerin described himself as coming from the school of, quote, anti-Stalinist Marxism, end quote, but as having for some time been in the habit of, quote, delving into the treasury of libertarian thought, end quote. Anarchism, Guerin insisted, was still relevant and still very much alive, quote, provided that it is first divested of a great deal of childishness, utopianism, and romanticism, end quote. Guerin went on to comment that because of this openness towards the contribution of anarchism, his book, Anarchism, had been misunderstood by some, and it did not mean that he had become a, quote, ecumenical, end quote, anarchist, to use Georges Fontenis's term, or Fontenis's term. It might be a Fonteny, I'm not sure. In Marxisme et Marxisme, in the article Anarchisme et Marxisme, written in 1973, Guerin emphasized that his book on anarchism had focused on, quote, social, constructive, collectivist, or communist anarchism, end quote, because this was the kind of anarchism which had most in common with Marxism. The reason Guerin gave for focusing on this kind of anarchism as opposed to insurrectionist, individualist, or illegalist anarchism or terrorism was that it was entirely relevant to the problems faced by contemporary revolutionaries. Quote, libertarian visions of the future, invite serious consideration. It is clear that they fulfill to a very large extent the needs of our times and that they can contribute to the building of our future, end quote. Guerin. But is this really, quote, classical anarchism, end quote, as Guerin put it, given the insistence on, quote, constructive anarchism, which depends on organization, on self-discipline, on integration, on federalist and non-coercive centralization, end quote. The emphasis on experiments in workers' control in Algeria, Yugoslavia, and Cuba, the openness to the idea that such states could be seen as socialist and capable of reform in a libertarian direction, question mark. This is not the conclusion of the English anarchist Nicholas Walter, whose review of No Gods, No Masters commented that, quote, the selection of passages shows a consistent bias towards activism, and the more intellectual, theoretical, and philosophical approach to anarchism is almost completely ignored, There is a similar bias towards revolution, and more moderate, pragmatic, and reformist approaches to anarchism is almost completely omitted as well, end quote. Nicholas Walter. As for Guerin's L'Anarchisme, Walter detected a similar bias towards Proudhon and Bakunin and was surprised at the emphasis on Gramsci, quote, which might be expected in a Marxist account, bracket, of the Italian workers' councils after the Great War, end bracket, but is refreshing in an anarchist one, end quote. Nicholas Walter. Walter also was skeptical about the attention paid to Algeria and Yugoslavia. In summary, however, these two books were, quote, the expression of an original and exciting view of anarchism, end quote. Nicholas Walter. So Guerin's two books arguably represented an original departure, and it's worth quoting some remarks made by Patrice Spadoni, who worked alongside Guerin in different libertarian communist groups in the 1970s and 1980s. Quote, it has to be said that Daniel Guerin's non-dogmatism never ceased to amaze us. In the 1970s, a period in which there was so much blinkeredness and sectarianism in our own ranks as well as among the Leninists, Daniel would often take us aback. The young libertarian communists that we were, turned pale with shock when he sang the praises of a Proudhon, of whom he was saying, quote, yes and no, end quote, while we said, quote, no and no, end quote. Then we would go white with horror when he started quoting Stirner, whom we loathed, without having really read him. Then we became livid when he began a dialogue with social democrats, and finally we practically had a meltdown when he expressed respect, albeit without agreeing with them, for the revolt of the militants associated with Action Directe, end quote. Patrice Spadoni. Two of these taboos are worth picking up when considering the extent to which Guerin takes on anarchism as a novel. Guerin's take on anarchism was a novel take. Proudhon and Stirner. New section. Proudhon and the fundamental importance of self-management. Proudhon had already ceased to be an ideological reference for any section of the French anarchist movement by at least the time of the Great War, except for a small minority of individualists opposed to any kind of collective ownership of the means of production. Most anarchists referred to either Kropotkin or Bakunin. This is partly because of the ambiguities in Proudhon's own writings regarding property, and partly because of the increasingly reactionary positions adopted by some of his, quote, mutualist followers after his death in 1865. The fact that Proudhon is so central to Guerin's, quote, rehabilitation, end quote, of anarchism is thus surprising and tells us something about what he was trying to do and how it is he came to study anarchism in such depth. Whereas Proudhon had already for many years been commonly referred to as the, quote, père de l'anarchie, the, quote, father of anarchy, end quote, Guerin refers to him as the, quote, père de l'autogestion, the, quote, father of self-management, end quote. This is the crux of the matter. Guerin was looking for a way to guarantee that in any future revolution, control of the workplace, of the economy, and of society as a whole would remain at the base, that spontaneous forms of democracy, like the Soviets in the beginning, would not be hijacked by any centralized power. Marx, Guerin insisted, hardly mentioned workers' control or self-management at all, whereas Proudhon paid it a great deal of attention. Workers' control was for Guerin, quote, without any doubt the most original creation of anarchism and goes right to the heart of contemporary realities, end quote. Guerin. Proudhon had been one of the first to try to answer the question raised by other social reformers of the early 19th century. As Guerin put it, quote, who should manage the economy? Private capitalism, the state, workers' organizations? In other words, there were and still are three options: free enterprise, nationalization, or socialization, i.e. self-management, end quote. Guerin. From 1840 onwards, Proudhon had argued passionately for the third option, something which set him apart from most other socialists of the time, who, like Louis Blanc, argued for one form or another of state control, if only on a transitional basis. Unlike Marx, Engels, and others, Guerin argued, Proudhon saw workers' control as a concrete problem to be raised now, rather than relegated to some distant future. As a consequence, he thought and wrote in detail about how it might function. Quote, almost all the issues which have caused such problems for present-day experiments in self-management were already foreseen and described in Proudhon's writings. End quote. Guerin. Stirner, the quote, father of anarchism. As for Stirner, generally anathema to the non-individualist wing of the anarchist movement, the answer lies in what Guerin perceived to be Stirner's latent homosexuality, Stirner's concern with sexual liberation, and his determination to attack bourgeois prejudice and Puritanism. Quote, Stirner was a precursor of May 68, end quote. Guerin. Stirner's, quote, greatest claim to originality, his most memorable idea, was his discovery of the, quote, unique individual, ... Stirner became, as a consequence, the voice of all those who throw down a challenge to normality, end quote. Guerin. What we can see here underlying Guerin's approving summary of the meaning and importance of Stirner is someone who had for many years been forced to suffer in silence because of the endemic homophobia of the labor movement, someone who had been forced by society's moral prejudice to live a not near schizoid existence, totally suppressing one half of his personality. It was Guerin's personal experience of an outrage at the homophobia of many Marxists, and what seemed to be classical Marxism's exclusive concern with materialism and class that accounts in large part for his sympathy with Stirner. So to the extent that Guerin insists that every anarchist is an individualist, at the same time as being a, quote, social anarchist, anarchiste sociétaire, to the extent that he approves of Stirner's emphasis on the uniqueness of each individual, is because he admires the determination to resist social conformism and moral prejudice. Guerin certainly had no truck with the precarious, quote, freedom of the individual, end quote, which by the 1920s had already become the stock mantra of those anarchists who rejected any attempt to produce a more ideologically and organizationally coherent revolutionary movement, or who wished to ground their action in a realistic, or in Guerin's words, quote, scientific analysis of social conditions. New section for a, quote, synthesis of Marxism and anarchism. Having called himself a, quote, libertarian socialist, end quote, in the late 1950s before going through a, quote, anarchist phase in the 1960s, by 1968 Guerin was advocating, quote, libertarian Marxism, a term Guerin would later change to, quote, libertarian communism in order not to alienate some of his new anarchist friends, though the content remained the same. In 1969, the Georges Fontany and others Guerin launched the Mouvement Communiste Libertaire, which attempted to bring together various groups, such as supporters of Denis Berger's Voix Communiste, former members of the FCL, and individuals such as Gabriel Combendit, who had been associated with Socialissime ou Barbarie. Guerin was responsible for the organization's paper, Guerre de Classe, Class War. In 1971, the MCL the Mouvement Communiste Libertaire merged with another group to become the Organisation Communiste Libertaire. In 1980, after complex debates notably over the question of trade union activity, Guerin, who rejected ultra-left forms of, quote, spontaneism, which condemned trade unionism as counter-revolutionary, would ultimately join the Union des Travailleurs Communistes Libertaires, UTCL, created in 1978. He would remain a member until his death in 1988. Looking back on those years, Georges Fentany would write, quote, "For us, bracket, the FCL, end bracket, as for Guerin, quote, libertarian Marxism, end quote, was never to be seen as a fusion or a marriage, but as a living synthesis very different from the sum of its parts," end quote. How should we interpret this? Guerin was always keen to emphasize the commonalities in Marxism and anarchism, and underscored the fact that, in his view at least, they share the same roots and the same objectives. Having said that, and despite the fact that Rubel seems to have influenced Guerin's study of Marx led him to suggest that those such as Rubel, who saw Marx as a libertarian, were exaggerating and or being too selective. Reviewing the ambivalent but predominantly hostile relations between Marx and Engels on the one hand and Stirner, Proudhon, and Bakunin on the other, Guerin concluded that the disagreements between them were based to a great extent on misunderstanding and exaggeration on both sides. Quote, "Each of the two movements needs the theoretical and practical contribution of the other," end quote, Guerin argued. And this is why he saw the expulsion of the Bakuninists from the International Working Men's Association Congress at The Hague in 1872 as, quote, "a disastrous event for the working class," end quote. Quote, "Libertarian communism," end quote, was for Guerin an attempt to, quote, revivify everything that was constructive in anarchism's contribution in the past," end quote. We have noted that his Anarchism, the book, focused on, quote, "social constructive collectivist or communist anarchism," end quote, Guerin. Guerin was more critical of, quote, "traditional anarchism," which he saw as its knee-jerk rejection, with what he saw as traditional anarchism's knee-jerk rejection of organization, and particularly what Guerin considered to be its Manichaean and simplistic approach to the question of the, quote, "state" in modern industrial and increasingly internationalized societies. Guerin became interested particularly in militants such as the Spanish anarchist Diego Abad de Santillan, whose ideas on, quote, "integrated economic self-management" contrasted with what Guerin insisted was the naive and backward-looking, quote, "libertarian communism," end quote, of the Spanish CNT advocated at its 1936 Saragossa conference by Isaac Puente and inspired, Guerin thought, by Kropotkin. Such a policy seemed to Guerin to take no account of the nature of modern consumer societies and the need for economic planning and coordination at national and transnational level. In this connection, Guerin also became interested in the ideas of the Belgian collectivist socialist César de Pape, who argued against the anarchists of the Jura Federation in favor of what he called a, quote, "an-archic state," end quote. César de Pape, or César de Pepe, I don't know how to say his name, on the national and transnational organization of public services within a libertarian framework. On the other hand, Guerin's libertarian Marxism or communism did not reject those aspects of Marxism which still seemed to Guerin valid and useful. One, the notion of alienation, much discussed since Erich Fromm's 1941 Fear of Freedom, and which Guerin saw as being in accordance with the anarchist emphasis on the freedom and autonomy of the individual. 2, the insistence that the workers shall be emancipated by the workers themselves. 3, the analysis of capitalist society. 5, the historical materialist dialectic, which for Guerin remained, quote, "one of the guiding threads enabling us to understand the past and the present, on condition that the method not be applied rigidly, mechanically, or as an excuse not to fight on the false pretext that the material conditions for a revolution are absent, as the Stalinists claimed was the case in France in 1936, 1945, and 1968. Historical materialism must never be reduced to determinism. The door must always be open to individual will and to the revolutionary spontaneity of the masses," end quote. Guerin. Indeed, following his focus on anarchism in the 1960s, Guerin returned in the 1970s to his earlier researches on Marxism, and in his new quest for a synthesis of the two ideologies, he found a particularly fruitful source in Rosa Luxemburg, in whom Guerin developed a particular interest, and Guerin played a role in the wider resurgence of interest in Rosa Luxemburg's ideas. Luxemburg was for Guerin the only German social democrat who stayed true to what he called, quote, "original Marxism," and in 1971 Guerin published an anthology of Luxemburg's critical writings on the pre-1914 SFIO, as well as an important study of the notion of spontaneity in her work. Guerin saw no significant difference between her conception of revolutionary working-class spontaneity and the anarchist one, nor between her conception of the, quote, "mass strike" and the syndicalist idea of the, quote, "general strike." Luxemburg's criticisms of Lenin in 1904 under the Bolshevik Party in the spring of 1918 regarding the democratic freedoms of the working class seemed to him very anarchistic, as did her conception of a socialism propelled from below by workers' councils. Luxemburg was, he argued, quote, one of the links between anarchism and authentic Marxism, end quote. And for this reason, she played an important role in the development of Guerin's thinking about convergences between certain forms of Marxism and certain forms of anarchism. Guerin was convinced that a libertarian communism, which represented such a synthesis of the best of Marxism and the best of anarchism, would be much more attractive to progressive workers than, quote, degenerate authoritarian Marxism or old, outdated, and fossilized anarchism, end quote, Guerin. But Guerin was adamant that he was not a theorist, that libertarian communism was as yet only a, quote, approximation, not a fixed dogma. Quote, it cannot, it seems to me, be defined on paper in absolute terms. Quote, it cannot, it seems to me, be defined on paper in absolute terms. It cannot be an endless raking over of the past, but must rather be a rallying point for the future. The only thing of which I am convinced is that the future social revolution will have nothing to do with either Muscovite despotism or anemic social democracy, that it will not be authoritarian, but libertarian and rooted in self-management, or if you like, councilist, end quote. Guerin. New section. Conclusion. To what extent, then, can we say that Guerin succeeded in producing a, quote, synthesis? Assessments by fellow revolutionaries have varied. Guerin himself used to complain that many militants were so attached to ideological pigeonholing, that quasi-tribal loyalties were so strong, that Guerin's purpose was frequently misunderstood, with many who identified as anarchists criticizing Guerin for having, quote, become a Marxist, and vice versa. Yet Guerin was always very clear that there have been many different Marxisms and many different anarchisms, and he also insisted that his understanding of, quote, libertarian communism, end quote, went beyond or transcended, quote, dépasse, both anarchism and Marxism. Nicholas Walter, in a broadly positive review of Guerin's work, and apparently struggling to characterize his politics, described him as a, quote, veteran socialist who became an anarchist, end quote, and as, quote, a Marxist writer of more or less Trotskyist variety, end quote, who had gone on to attempt a synthesis between Marxism and anarchism before finally turning to, quote, a syndicalist form of anarchism, end quote. George Woodcock, in a review of Noam Chomsky's introduction to the monthly Review Press edition of Guerin's Anarchism, insisted that, quote, George Woodcock, in a review of Noam Chomsky's introduction to the monthly Review Press edition of Guerin's Anarchism, insisted that, quote, neither is an anarchist by any known criterion. They are both left-wing Marxists, end quote. Their failing having been to focus too narrowly on the economic, on workers' control, on a, quote, obsolete, quote, anarcho-syndicalist perspective. Such a judgment is clearly based on a particular and not uncontentious conception of anarchism. The opposite conclusion was drawn by another anarchist, Miguel Chueca, who has argued that if we look at all the major issues dividing anarchists from Marxists, namely according to Guerin's Pour un Marxisme libertaire, for a libertarian Marxism, the post-revolutionary, quote, withering away, end quote, of the state, the role of minorities or vanguards or avant-gardes, and the resort to bourgeois democratic methods, the, quote, synthesis results, in all cases, in a choice in favor of the anarchist position, end quote. Miguel Chueca. Chueca seems to have based his conclusion on an essentialist view of anarchism in the singular and of Marxism, and on an identification of Marxism with Leninism. He appears to disregard some significant issues, such as Guerin's insistence on the historical materialist dialectic, and the need for centralized, albeit, quote, non-coercive, end quote, economic planning. Writing from a sympathetic but not uncritical Trotskyist perspective, Ian Birchall suggested that ultimately Guerin's greatest achievement was his practice as a militant. Guerin's greatness lay in his role as a mediator rather than as a synthesist. Over 6 decades, he had a record of willingness to cooperate with any section of the French left that shared his fundamental goals of proletarian self-emancipation, colonial liberation, and sexual freedom. Did I say this was a quote? Let me start over. Quote, Guerin's greatness lay in his role as a mediator rather than as a synthesist. Over 6 decades, Guerin had a record of willingness to cooperate with any section of the French left that shared his fundamental goals of proletarian self-emancipation, colonial liberation, and sexual freedom. Guerin was a vigorous polemicist, but saw no fragment on the left, however obscure as beneath his attention. Guerin was also typically generous, never seeking to malign his opponents, however profoundly he disagreed with them. Guerin was always willing to challenge orthodoxy, whether Marxist or anarchist. Yet behind the varying formulations, one consistent principle remained, quote, "The revolution of our age will be made from below or not at all," end quote. Others have embraced Guerin's theoretical contribution, and it is clear that his ideas on a, quote, libertarian Marxism, or, quote, libertarian communism, were enormously influential from the 1960s onwards, and many today, notably, but not only those in France close to the organization Alternative Libertaire, see in him a precursor and are admiring of his theoretical and practical contributions to the search for a libertarian communism, albeit as a contribution which needed further development in the context of the social struggles of the 1980s and beyond. Indeed, Guerin was the first to accept that he had not yet seen the, quote, definitive crystallization of such an unconventional and difficult synthesis, end quote, which had, quote, emerged from social struggles, end quote, with, quote, innovative forms which nobody today can claim to predict, end quote. Guerin, quote, "It would be pointless to try to paper over the cracks in the more or less crumbling and rotting edifice of socialist doctrines, to plug away at patching together some of those fragments of traditional Marxism and Anarchism which are still useful. To launch oneself into demonstrations of Marxian or Bakunian erudition, to attempt to trace, merely on paper, ingenious syntheses or tortuous reconciliations, to call oneself a libertarian communist today does not mean looking backwards but towards the future. The libertarian communist is not an exegete but a militant," end quote. Daniel Guerin. That's the end of the piece. Thanks for listening.